The Wolf, a Chronicle, is a narrative poem from 1920 by Yiddish-language author Leivik Halpern, known by his pen name H. Leivik. It begins as a lone rabbi wakes in a destroyed shtetl, or Jewish village, finding himself the only survivor of a pogrom. Sick with grief, the rabbi tries to pray, but somehow he has forgotten the words and becomes nauseous. He flees to the nearby forest where he lets out a strange cry and transforms into a wolf. Soon after, Jews expelled from other villages gather at the shtetl and rebuild. But at night, they can hear the strange cries of the wolf coming from the forest. One day, the rabbi returns in human form. At first, the people are happy to see him, but he admonishes them for rebuilding. He begs them to kill him, and they react with sympathy until he bites one of them, and the people flee. Each night, the people can hear the cries of the wolf, but the cries cease on the eve of Yom Kippur. When the wolf finally attacks, breaking into the town's synagogue, the people are forced to pummel him to death. Suddenly, they begin to weep when they see before them, lying in a river of blood, not a wolf, but a Jew in a rabbinical fur hat. The rabbi tells them not to cry. He says he's fine now. While the story begins with the rabbi, it's not so much about him as it is about the new inhabitants of the shtetl. They're survivors. They want nothing more than to go on living, but they cannot help but be haunted by those who did not survive. Their lives would always be a testament to that loss. Its cry would always be heard. The fact that this story was written in 1920 and not 1945 denotes, as Dara Horn remarks in her article for Tablet magazine, Message from a Yiddish Werewolf, that the poem, quote, makes it clear that the Holocaust was merely an exponential expansion of previous massacres. It is generally accepted that Leivik's poem is an allusion to what are sometimes called the Petliura pogroms, named after the supreme commander of the Ukrainian People's Army, or UNA, Simon Petliura. These mass killings of thousands of Russian Jews were carried out by the UNA during the Russian Civil War. Leivik had not been the first person to connect Jews with werewolves, though. In medieval times, the Rabbi HaHasid wrote about werewolfism in his commentary on the Torah, saying that Benjamin, 12th son of Jacob and leader of one of the last remaining 12 tribes of Israel, was a werewolf. The rabbi even believed that Benjamin's offspring would continue to exhibit signs of lycanthropy, including being born with a full set of teeth. Israel ben Eliezer, also known as the Baal Shem Tov, regarded as the founder of Hasidic Judaism, was said to have done battle with a werewolf, a story detailed in the 4th chapter of the Shivhei HaBesht, a collection of supposedly true stories recounted by the Baal Shem Tov's followers in the year 1814 CE. It's likely that Leivik was aware of some of these connections and was at least partly inspired by them to write The Wolf. 13 years later, a German Jewish novelist named Kurt Siodmak was working as a successful screenwriter in Babelsberg, Germany, when he received a letter from the National Socialist Chamber of German Writers. The letter said that, as a Jew, Siodmak would no longer be permitted to write for any German publisher or motion picture company. Siodmak had no intention of retiring, though. He left for France and would later move on to England, where he would find success writing the script for a film called Transatlantic Tunnel. In 1937, Siodmak moved to America, where he would once again find work as a screenwriter in Hollywood. 2 years later, the writer was approached by his friend, director Joe May, about writing the screenplay for The Invisible Man Returns. The film was a success, and Siodmak would go on to write Black Friday and The Invisible Woman for Universal Pictures before being offered a new project that had originally been intended to star Boris Karloff, The Wolfman. Though Universal had already made 1935's Werewolf of London, that film had been a box office disappointment, and the studio was hoping to have another go at the concept. Karloff was busy, so Lon Chaney Jr. was chosen to star, along with Claude Rains and Bela Lugosi in supporting roles. Siodmak was told that shooting would start in 10 weeks. It was a yes or no proposition. Siodmak accepted the job, and 7 weeks later turned in his script to director George Wagner. According to Siodmak, Wagner made virtually no cuts to the material, only doing so to combine locations for ease of shooting. In The Wolfman, American immigrant Larry Talbot, played by Lon Chaney Jr., comes back to visit his ancestral home in Wales for the funeral of his brother and to see his father, Sir John Talbot. Larry later stops in a local antique shop to flirt with a shopgirl, Gwen, and ends up buying a silver wolf's head cane with a 5-sided star on it. Gwen explains that this star, which she calls a pentagram, is the symbol of the werewolf, an ordinary man cursed to transform into a wolf at certain times of the year. Gwen also says that the werewolf always sees a pentagram on the palm of his next victim. Larry finds out that Gwen is engaged, but clearly still has feelings for her, and continues trying to talk to her. Later, Gwen's friend Jenny is having her palm read by a Romani fortune teller named Bela, played by Bela Lugosi. Bela sees the star on Jenny's hand, and later that night transforms into a wolf, attacking her. Larry attempts to save Jenny, beating the wolf to death with his silver wolf's head cane, but is bitten in the process. Investigating the scene, the police find the bodies of both Jenna and Bela, casting serious suspicions on Larry, whose story of killing a wolf doesn't seem to make much sense. As Gwen is engaged, and she and Larry were together when the incident occurred, the town is full of talk of an affair. All in all, this makes Larry a very unpopular guy, but his problems get worse when Bela's mother Mileva informs him that Bela was a werewolf, and now so is Larry. To prevent him from transforming, Mileva gives Larry a charm with the pentagram on it, but desperate not to believe and unsure what to do, he gives it to Gwen instead and becomes a wolfman that very night. The pentagram is an ancient symbol used by many religions, but in Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, it represents justice, mercy, wisdom, understanding, and transcendent splendor, and it was also the official seal of Jerusalem around 300 to 150 BCE. More ominously, in Siodmak's script, the symbol appears on anyone marked for death by the wolf. This may be due to the fact that the pentagram, a 5-sided star, is similar to the 6-sided Jewish Star of David. Only 2 years prior to the Wolfman's release, Jews in Nazi-occupied Poland would be forced to wear armbands and badges with the Star of David on them. This was only a prelude to what would come next. Siodmak's inclusion of the Romani people may be the writer's subtle reference to the Romani and Jewish people's similar experiences as historically nomadic cultures, and their shared persecution at the hands of Hitler's Germany. Though silver had been thought of as a weapon against evil since ancient times due to its perceived purity, it does appear that Siodmak solidified its connection to werewolves. It's likely a coincidence, but silver happens to be a popular metal to use for making holy Jewish objects, sometimes called Judaica, as it is both durable and easy to work with. In Judaism, silver also represents ethical innocence and sanctity. Siodmak's Larry Talbot is clearly a victim, not truly responsible for his condition, but given his situation, he is not an ideal victim. That is to say, a victim who evokes the most sympathy from society, and in the sequel, he becomes a drifter, unwelcome wherever he goes. As the audience, we sympathize with the Wolfman, but the world he lives in does not. In a particularly interesting scene towards the end of the first film, Talbot attends the funeral of a man he killed in wolf form. As he enters a Christian church, probably hundreds of years old, the eyes of the locals turn toward him one by one, beaming with suspicion. More than any scene in the film, this one gives a true sense of paranoia that Siodmak would have known well. In an interview for Dennis Fisher's Interviews with Screenwriters of the 1940s and the 1950s, Siodmak would say, quote, "I wrote many horror films. The fantastic and the macabre is a German trait. Look at their fairy tales, which are pretty gruesome. We refugees suffer from the past, the Hitler persecution, which we will never be able to absorb completely. We were often so close to death that we are branded for life. No success could wipe out the past which we went through." Later, only a year before his death, Siodmak would say in another interview, "I am the Wolfman. I was forced into a fate I didn't want, to be a Jew in Germany. I would not have chosen that as my fate. The swastika represents the moon. When the moon comes up, the man doesn't want to murder, but he knows he cannot escape it. Interestingly, the first Wolfman movie does not actually say that a full moon is necessary for Talbot's transformation, only a bright one. But Siodmak would go on to include this idea in the sequel, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. Along with silver and the full moon, Siodmak invented the concept that someone becomes a werewolf by being bitten by another werewolf. And so in many ways, the modern concept of what a werewolf is comes completely from this film. Completely from Siodmak. Ultimately appearing in 5 movies, Lon Chaney Jr. as Larry Talbot / the Wolfman would never get his own dedicated sequel, but he would be the only Universal monster not to be recast throughout the original series of films. In fact, the Wolfman would become Lon Chaney Jr.'s most iconic role. Siodmak's script includes the line, "Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night can become a wolf when the wolfsbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright." One of the defining characteristics of werewolves is that anyone can be one, and you can't really tell just by looking at them, a trait shared by many Jews. 40 years later, this concept would be built upon by Jewish-American filmmaker John Landis, with An American Werewolf in London. While Jewish identity was a subtle theme in The Wolfman, An American Werewolf in London makes this more overt, with the protagonist, recent college graduate from New York City, David Kessler, being explicitly identified as a Jewish man. The story starts with David and his friend Jack traveling in northern England as part of a 3-month trip through Europe. The two friends stop at a small pub for a rest, but find that they are not particularly welcome there, especially after asking why there's a 5-pointed star on the wall. On a side note here, Jack actually identifies the symbol as the sign of the werewolf, directly referencing the Lon Chaney Jr. Universal films. This feels very ahead of its time, and it's something I don't hear a lot of people talking about. Things get heated, and David and Jack leave, though the barmaid insists that the villagers can't let them go. One of the villagers tells her, "No one brought them here. No one wanted them here." I find this line particularly interesting for obvious reasons. Suddenly, the villagers hear the howl of a wolf. The barmaid once again pleads with the others to do something, but they pretend not to hear anything. While wandering the moors, the two friends are attacked by the massive wolf. Jack is killed, while David is injured but ultimately saved by the townsfolk. Unlike Lon Chaney Jr.'s character in The Wolfman, David is a stranger in a strange land, but Landis makes this isolation more pointed when a nurse remarks that she knows David is a Jew because she's had a look, referring to David having been circumcised. But Nurse Alex points out that this is actually typical for lots of people. This tells us that Alex's view of David is not framed within his Jewish identity. She just sees him as a person. David begins the film as someone who appears fully assimilated into society, but he is almost immediately ostracized by the Yorkshire locals, and this sense of isolation seems to grow exponentially throughout the story. Prior to the Holocaust, the phrase, "more German than the Germans," was used as a sarcastic comment on the unprecedented assimilation of Jews into German society following the Enlightenment. As the phrase suggests, this assimilation by the Jews of Germany would not save them from the horrors of the Shoah. Just like The Wolfman, American Werewolf is set in Europe, evoking not only a traditional homogeneity, but also reminding us that although anti-Semitism had been a widespread form of bigotry in ancient Greece and Rome, it was in Europe that it would be institutionalized. Later, David recovers and begins to experience horrible nightmares brought on by the attack, the most terrifying of which is an assault on David's home and family by a troupe of werewolf-esque monsters in SS uniforms. The monsters slaughter David and his family and set their house ablaze. It's honestly the scariest scene in the whole movie, and it's not even directly related to the werewolf plot. I think this scene is also the most important in the film, because it makes it clear that this is a story about the general paranoia that post-World War II Jews have had to deal with. Soon after, David starts receiving visits from his dead friend Jack. Jack tells David that Jack is caught in a limbo state, unable to move on to the afterlife until the wolf's curse is broken with David's death. The strong sense of guilt inherent in these scenes in many ways becomes the central focus of the rest of the film. The idea that Jack will only be free once David is dead suggests that the survivor's guilt may never be fully alleviated. Maybe David was always fated to live this nightmare. Maybe he was always a monster to the world. Becoming a werewolf just allowed him to see it more clearly. In the end, Alex once again sees David's humanity first, even in his wolf form. An American Werewolf in London is undoubtedly the definitive Jewish werewolf film. Of course, the werewolf has been used as a metaphor for many things, including the difficult experience of female menstruation, with such films as Ginger Snaps, or even Turning Red. Yes, werepandas count in my book, but I've always found the Jewish interpretation most interesting for a number of reasons. Recently, the first trailer for the Lee 1L remake of The Wolfman was released. At the time of making this video, I haven't actually seen the film yet, but just from the trailer, it looks like the theme of this new iteration will be a comment on male aggression or toxic masculinity or whatever you want to call it, which honestly, that's fine. That's a fine theme. I'm not complaining about that. I just think it's kind of simplistic and boring for a Wolfman movie. Not to mention, Dracula or even Jekyll and Hyde are better representations of this idea. I'm certainly not the first person to bring these things up, and references to Jewish werewolves can be found in shows like Being Human, with the lapsed Jew werewolf George Sanders, or 30 Rock, with Werewolf Bar Mitzvah. Both 1941's The Wolfman and 1981's An American Werewolf in London can be found on DVD, Blu-ray, and 4K disc, and are available to rent on Amazon Prime. So that one kind of spiraled. It took longer to do than I thought it would, and I kept finding more stuff and wanting to put it in, and I hope you guys enjoyed that one. I might be doing a little too much interpreting lately, like, oh, this is what I think this means and stuff, so I'm going to try to do something different for the next one, but, these are just things that I've thought of over the years that I've always wanted to talk about, and so here it is. I was going to do a different one, but that one wasn't really working, and so I switched to this one on the spot, and that kind of slowed me down, and then I had a friggin' car problem, which I'm not going to get into, but, so, sorry that this episode is out late, and I'm going to get back on track after this, and, apologies about that, and thank you to everyone for sticking with me and, supporting the channel and everything. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. Again, if you've enjoyed these Halloween-style videos, this one is out late, I'm going to do more in April, because I consider April to be 2nd October, because I'm insane like that. There's also this holiday in Europe called Walpurgis Night, and I basically treat that as second Halloween here in America. So that's what I'm going to do for the channel. So if you like Halloween stuff, get ready for more in April. Hope you liked it, and I'll see you guys next week. I am a Park Narks. Woo!